you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? Excellent, excellent. So I am going to take you on a journey where you will see that change is possible. It's a journey that I have been on for the past 20 years. It's a journey that at the end of my talk, you will understand that we can change this country forever. When you think about the path to success, what do you think about? Well, we know there's no singular path. We know that there's no one cookie cutter way to become successful. But you might agree with me that there are some key ingredients to becoming successful. Things like a good education, good health, a good paying job, an excellent business, a successful business, a warm and supportive community. These are ingredients that lead to success. But have you ever stopped and thought about the importance of housing? Or do you simply take it for granted that it is always there? Imagine not having a place to go home to tonight. Imagine not having a home. How is it possible that all of these other ingredients on the path to success will be available to you? How difficult would it be to think about getting a job or to take care of a loved one or to even focus on your studies if you have no home? You would be singly focused on just that item. Housing plays a very fundamental role to everything that we do. So fundamental, most of us don't even think about it. But imagine for those families who have no place to sleep tonight. I began my journey on thinking about housing as key ingredient to the path to success when I began working as a congressional staffer many years ago. And there, it was the first time I realized the importance of national policy on creating and sustaining housing, but not just housing, housing that was available to different incomes of families in this country. I then doubled down on the theory when I moved over to the US Department of Housing and Urban Development and actually had a hand in creating programmatic and policies that made sure that we were helping housing to become not just preserved, but to create new housing that was fairly available to all people. And now, as a director of the DC Housing Authority, I work directly with moms and dads and grandparents and veterans to make sure that they are able to attain housing, and not just attain housing, but we actually use housing as a platform for that path to success. That is what we do. That is what we do. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. And if you are as familiar with DC as I am, you've seen a lot of change. I don't know how many of you have been there recently. And over those 25 years, but particularly over the past 10 years, there's been tremendous change. Now, I'm a foodie, so I love all the new restaurants. I really enjoy the nightlife. I love the new parks. I love all of the new amenities that are available in DC. It's a great place to be. It's a great place to visit. Please come down and spend your dollars. But the one thing I notice about DC right now is the impact of having 1,000 new people move into the city each and every month. 1,000 new people are moving in each month. And all those people need some place to live. And when people move into a city with a higher income, it creates a pressure on those families who don't make as much money in terms of being able to afford housing, because rents may increase, the cost of a homeownership unit increases. So where does someone who make a little bit of money or almost no money live? The concept of affordable housing, affordability, is very personal. It's about what you make, it's about what you make, it's about what you make. It is an income concept, and it is applied to how much you can afford. Let me explain that to you using a visual. So when you look at this house, you think, this looks like, middle-class housing, something for the upper middle class, maybe something some of you want to attain. But compare it with this, maybe the middle class can't afford this one. This is housing more for the wealthy. Just visually, we think it's probably a couple $1 million. That is a home for a wealthy, something the middle class cannot afford. But imagine you don't make any money at all or just a little bit of money. You're certainly not going to live in either of those two houses. where will you live? Now, I want to explain to you the concept of affordability for the very low income using three numbers: 30, 100, and 40. You don't have to write it down. It's okay. 30, 100, and 14. 30. As a rule, if you are paying 30% or less of your income on housing, that's affordable housing. That's affordable housing. It's as simple as that. You have affordable housing. And that test applies to no matter your income range. 100. If you live in Washington, D.C., and you make minimum wage, you would have to work over 100 hours a week, not a month, 100 hours a week in order to afford a 2-bedroom unit. Incidentally, that 100 or so hours is the same standard for here in Maryland. That's a lot of hours. When you think about the average person is working 40 hours a week. 14. On average, the families that are housed by the DC Housing Authority make no more than $14,000 a year, far less than the $58,000 that's needed for that same 2-bedroom unit. If you're making $14,000 a year, where do you live? You don't live in the middle class home. You certainly don't live in the wealthy. Where do you live? Maybe you live here. This is an example of public housing in DC. So you're going to say, you can't fool us. That's not public housing. Come on, we've seen public housing. That's not it. Not only is that public housing in some parts of DC, it is public housing in many parts of the rest of the country. We have an image of public housing that probably looks more like this. Feels more familiar? This is the public housing that you know? That's unfortunate, because this represents actually a small minority of public housing in this country. And it's because of images like this, and that's a site in DC and the famous Robert Taylor homes in Chicago that's since been torn down. But those are the images of public housing that you feel more comfortable with. And because of these images, this program has become very unpopular. Not just unpopular to you, but unpopular to the many, many people who actually are responsible for funding it. And so it becomes sort of a catch-22. It's unpopular, and so it's underfunded, it's unfunded, so it continues to look distressed. And as you see from this bar chart, public housing is singularly one of the most underfunded federal housing programs that exists, and it's unfair. It is fundamentally unfair because tonight, there are over 2 million people who will rely on this housing for their path to success. Over 2 million people, their idea of, I've got a home, I've got some place to be, is in a public housing unit. Now, there have been many stories about public housing, but one of the few stories is all of the successes that have come out of it. Those families who have used public housing on their own personal path to success, the same way that you use yours. So I'm going to give a couple examples of folks who have lived in public housing. So you recognize this fella, Marvin Gaye? When I told my daughter I was going to come and do this talk, I said, honey, I'm gonna do a little Marvin Gaye. I'm going to sing that song you like. She says, Mom, please, don't embarrass the family. It'll be for generations to come before I'm able to live it down. And so I apologize, I will not be able to sing any Marvin Gaye to you, but catch me at intermission. There's going to be a song. There's going to be a song in the back. But Marvin Gaye grew up in public housing in Washington, D.C. He spent some years there. And he lived at a site called East Capitol Dwellings. That was part of his path to success, having that home. And he moved on to become the idol of a musician that he was. Perhaps you recognize this lady, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Justice Sotomayor grew up in New York, in the Bronx. She grew up in public housing, and actually I think they named the public housing site she lived in after her. But Justice Sotomayor left public housing in New York. She went off to Princeton. She graduated from Yale Law School, And certainly, I would like to submit that she has achieved sort of uber success in terms of now sitting on the highest court in the land. She used public housing as her foundation for her path to success. And finally, there's this guy. Anybody? Nobody? Anybody? Alexander Hamilton. That's right. Now, okay. So Hamilton really wasn't alive when public housing was formed. But he grew up as a child in poverty. He grew up very, very poor. He is a fellow West Indian. He was born on the island of Nevis and grew up in St. Croix. But he really didn't have a good community support. His father disowned him. He grew up with a single mom, and then eventually he was an orphan. And he was 12 or 13 working a full-time job. But if it wasn't for a community of benefactors, people who actually looked at him and didn't just see some poor kid, who actually saw that he was a bright young boy who would achieve great things. And by gosh, didn't he? This country's first Treasury Secretary. And I think there's something about a Broadway play. Have you heard about that? No? I read something. So these three people, well, two, epitomize what public housing and the importance of public housing, and certainly with all three, the importance of a supportive community. And the three of these individuals didn't come up alone, but poverty still exists. Poverty still exists, I'm sad to report. And when you think about the programs like public housing and welfare and food stamps and Head Start, you've been told that these programs that are wrapped up as part of the war on poverty have failed. That if poverty still exists, how is it possible that the war on poverty has been a success? Allow me to submit to you today that the war on poverty did not fail. Because I dare you to say that to a mom whose only source of food for a month is through the food stamp program. Or say to the grandmother who's been able to care for her entire family and push them forward on their path to success because of public housing. The war on poverty didn't fail, but poverty does exist. So I like to introduce the concept of moving away from the war on poverty and actually adopting an accord on opportunity. And with this accord, we will all agree that while poverty may always exist, we will do everything we can as a collective community to remove the barriers that people have to their own success. We will remove barriers to having a good education. We'll remove barriers to good health care. We'll remove barriers to a fair criminal justice system. It is important to have an accord on opportunity so that we can help our collective fellows move forward. And what's key to that accord? Housing. Because if you don't have a place to live, then all other facets of the accord will be very, very difficult to achieve. And that brings me back to the concept of housing as a platform. Every single day when I go to work, and sometimes when I walk into the lobby, I'm stopped because people recognize my face and they're like, "Ms. Todman, I just need some place to live. I need a home, and I'll take the rest. I don't need anything else. I really don't." And we have these stories all the time where we're able to help families and they're able to achieve. And let me introduce you to two of them. This is Joe Strong. Joe was a single middle-class guy. He was a homeowner. He put two of his his kids through college and was doing great until he lost his job. He lost his job and he became depressed. And he had to sadly ask his family to take care of one of his kids. And he lived on the streets. He's a Vietnam vet, and he hung out in the streets with a group of other veterans in DC. When Joe came to the Housing Authority, he was despondent. And I am just so grateful that my staff and staff of the Veterans Administration were able to house Joe. And as you can see in this picture, Joe's doing great. His son is back. He's a thriving straight A student. Joe is actually applying to law school. Okay, that's a whole different story. He was applying to law school. I promise not to make any lawyer jokes. And he actually now is looking forward to trying to even become a homeowner. Joe's doing very well. I'd like to also introduce you to Shanita Jefferson. Shanita is a young lady I met over 10 years ago. And Shanita, when I met her, was a mom, a single mom, 2 kids. She was looking for a job. She grew up in one of the toughest sites in DC called Barry Farm. And she was still on assisted housing when she came to us, but in housing. When I met Shanita, I saw in her what I suspect many people saw in a young Alexander Hamilton, which was somebody who needed a break, somebody who was terribly bright, and somebody who was really going to work hard to make something of herself. And she did. Today she's a homeowner. Both of her kids are in college. I think one's about to graduate. And Shanita is doing a wonderful job. And every time I see her, every time I see Shanita, I smile because I know that with the availability of the affordable housing she had, she was able to not just lift herself up, but to lift up her 2 children as well. So Joe and Shanita are not isolated stories. They represent the hundreds of people across the country and the thousands of people that my colleagues and I work with every single day so that they can be successful. And so I want you to walk away from this knowing that with the housing that we provide, that the government provides, we are able to make a difference for not just the middle class, of course, not the wealthy, but certainly we can use housing as a platform for all of our low-income families. And so the next time you see a little girl, you're walking by perhaps a public housing site here in Baltimore or elsewhere, and you see a little girl jumping rope, I want you to ask yourself, maybe she is the next Sonia Sotomayor. Or if you're walking along the street at night and you see a young man with dreads or braids, I want you to stop and ask yourself, perhaps he is the next Alexander Hamilton. Thank you so much for your time.